Well, we're only partway through the service, and I've already added something high on my to-do list. I want to meet the guys that studied the Bible with Umberto. I've studied the Bible with a lot of people over the years, but I never had anybody threaten to fight me after I was done, much less to do it repeatedly and then go visit them in the hospital. I mean, those are great guys. They clearly had already gotten the message that we're going to talk about today, which is trusting God. And so that's our theme today. And really, this is an introduction of a theme that we're going to be looking at over the course of this upcoming year, because it's so critical to what we do as disciples. I've said often, and I'll say it again since it's my topic today, really a lot of what the Bible has to say to us can almost be reduced down to two words, and that's God saying to us, trust me. That's the relationship that he wants with us and what we're called to. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Are we at the end? Well, this thing's not working for some reason. Maybe Gary put the batteries in backwards just to keep me guessing. I was making a joke when I said that, but it's really true. Sorry, Gary, didn't mean to throw you under the bus like that. Okay. No, still no. Ho! There we go. All right, did you do that or did I do that? Okay. Well, they'll sort that out. This is going to be a long sermon if I have to tell her to change it for every bullet point. So we're going to talk about trusting God, and I get to practice right off the jump with the clicker. We've got to trust God if we're disciples. Go ahead and change the slide. So, we got it? Oh, man, that's awesome. Thank you, Jared. Bonus points for you. We're going to be talking about heroes of the faith later. I'll have to put him on there. All right, so here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about trusting in the old and new, and there'll probably be some testaments involved in that. Then we're going to talk about a couple of troubling phrases that we're going to encounter during our sermon today. We're going to talk about the relationship between trust, faith, and belief. This part's going to be fun, so look forward to that. We're going to get to shake hands with some heroes in the Bible, and then we're going to talk about the concept of trust versus the reality of trust, and really concept versus reality in an overall way. And last, we're going to talk about watchwords to live by. That'll make sense when we actually get there. So let's start in Hebrews 11. You can open up your Bibles or you can read it on the screen. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was made out of what was not visible. By faith, Abel brought God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke of his offerings, spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists, and he rewards those who earnestly seek him. It's interesting. We have this verse in Hebrews 11, chapter 6, that we refer to often. And it is, without faith, it is impossible to please God. And that's a great verse. But it's interesting how it's used here in this text. In the text, he's making a logical argument that Enoch had faith, and his argument is Enoch pleased God, and he had to have faith because if you don't have faith, it's not possible to please him. And so we know indirectly that Enoch had faith, even though it doesn't say it directly, because he pleased God. And so that's what we're after, is we're after having a life where we please God. Now, maybe you're saying to yourself, well, preacher, you've got trusting God on top of your slide there, but you're reading a verse about faith. That's cheating. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about this idea of faith in the Old and New Testament. Let me give you an inside look at what it's like to prepare a sermon on this topic. All right? You go to get out your trusty concordance and you look up the word trust. It's a logical place to start because you're preaching on trust, right? So you say to yourself, well, I'm going to get a bunch of verses on trust because that's what I'm going to talk about. And so we've got this theme of trusting God. Here's what you find out when you get your concordance out. There's a whole lot of trust in the Old Testament. I mean, pages of verses in the Old Testament that say trust, the word trust. But the word faith almost doesn't even appear in the Old Testament. Well, that's peculiar. So then you say, well, yeah, but we're Christians. We use the New Testament a lot. So I want some great New Testament verses on trust. Well, what you find out is in the New Testament, there's a whole lot of faith, but very little trust. This is an odd thing. And here's the thing about these words when you look at the Old Testament and the New Testament, even where these words occur in the New Testament or the Old Testament, the minor form where it comes up is not what you expect. And like, for example, where faith shows up in the Old Testament, it's saying something like, he broke faith with him. It's not talking about their faith. And in the New Testament, when trust shows up, similarly, it's like, I have been given a trust. It's not, I trust God, typically. Even the verse that I had at the beginning of the presentation, where Jesus says, you trust in God, trust also in me. You might have caught that in your newer version of the NIV or a lot of translations, it doesn't say trust there. This is my newfangled NIV that I have here at the building, and it says believe. So what's going on with all of that? Before we get to that, I want to talk about this idea of troubling phrases. Here are two phrases that I think are often troubling to us. Trust God and have faith. Now, what could be wrong with these phrases? Well, in terms of how we use them, sometimes we think they mean something other than what they mean at face value. Here's what I'm talking about. Trust God can sometimes equal get with the program. Comply. You're having a conversation with somebody and you're telling them something you don't like, and they say, well, you need to trust God. That can be dismissive. And the phrase have faith can mean I don't have any answer to what you just asked me about. So the best I can do is, I pour out my heart to you and I tell you this is what's going on with me. And you stand there and think about it for a while and then you say, have faith, because you don't have anything to give me other than that. Those are great. Both of them are great admonitions, but sometimes they mean something else. Now, you can add extra sizzle to these things by adding in, a brother or a sister or a bro or sis. Well, you got to trust God, bro. That really gives you a little emphasis there. This isn't what we're talking about today. We're not talking about saying you need to trust God because you don't like something that's going on in your life. We're talking about the real concept of trusting God and having faith. So we got that out of the way. All right. So let's talk about these words, trust, faith, and belief. As I was preparing for this sermon, and it started with me, and then it spread to my son when he was visiting, and then I've talked to several other people. I threw out the idea to several people, what are the differences and similarities between trust and faith? I didn't even include belief in the question. But now I got some really interesting answers to this question. Some people just said, that's interesting, and then thought of something they needed to do and went away. In other cases, I got some really interesting philosophical answers. I mean, I started out with one of those. There was going to be a point in this lesson when I started out that said, well, faith is a point-in-time decision, but trust is a longer-term pattern that's rooted in relationship. Boy, that sounds impressive, doesn't it? It's got no bearing to the truth, but it sounded good. And a lot of the answers I got were along those lines. So, but then you got to study the Bible and see what the Bible has to say. Trust, faith, and belief, these three words. Here's the deal. Greek, now if you're good at pronouncing Greek, you can correct me later. But the two Greek words that are in play here are pistiu and pistis. Same word. Same word. One is the verb form, one is the noun form. By the way, there was one person I asked this question to, Dean Limbaugh, that said, oh, they're the same thing. They're just two forms of the same Greek word. So, bonus credit for Dean. But, they're the same word, two different forms. Pistiu is the word that is translated trust. It's the verb form. Now, I was also going to make this point about, well, trust is an action and faith is a thing, just because that's probably not valid either. But that's the verb form. That's what's translated trust. Depending on what Bible you have in the New Testament, that's translated trust 9 times. It's translated some form of believe 206 times. So, the words are interchangeable. It's just a question of how they're translated. Pistis is translated faith 221 times. It's translated believe 10 times and trust once. Okay, you may not care about all this stuff. What I'm trying to get across to you is these words are talking about the same thing. We're not talking about wildly different ideas when we talk about these things. And yet we use these words as though they were different things. That's what was revealed when I started thinking about it and I started asking people about it. So here's the deal. Let's go to recess, okay? I used to ask my son, what was your favorite class today? Recess. That was always his favorite class. And so let's go to recess. Anybody recognize this? Now, maybe your school wasn't fancy enough to have the color coding in here and you just had chalk drawn on the playground, but this is the game Foursquare. Anybody ever play Foursquare? I'll give you a quick tip. When the pickleball craze dries up and people aren't concerned about pickleball anymore, this may be the next big thing. Because that's what we do, we grow up and we can't run around anymore, so we find some game we played as a kid, and that's what we do. So Foursquare. So there we are. So let's fill in our Foursquare game. Square number 1, trust. Square number 2, belief. Square number 3, faith. And here comes the wild card, obey. Oh, how did that get in there? What's obey got to do with our topic that we're talking about trusting God? What's obey? Well, here's the thing. Biblically, obedience is part of the question. In John chapter 8, verse 31, we're not going to turn there, but it's probably familiar to you. To the Jews who had believed him, Jesus said, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples, then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. You've got to hold to his teaching. You've got to obey if you trust. They go together. The other place the Bible talks about belief that's detached from the idea of obedience is in James chapter 2. That's much too long for us to read today. But the Bible always, real biblical faith and trust and belief always involves obedience and action. It does talk about this detached faith, but it doesn't talk about it favorably. And so we've got these 4 squares, and we get these weird combinations in the way that we think. Maybe I say, well, I believe in God. I have faith in God, but I don't really obey him. We've all lived that life, right? I know I need to do things differently. I'm not really obedient, but I believe. Or then we have some really strange ones, some unique ones. Well, I believe in God and I obey God, but if I'm being honest, I don't really trust him. That happens. If we've got stuff we're carrying around, sometimes we have trust issues with people or with God, even if we're trying to do the right thing. So we get these combinations. Here's the thing. God isn't playing four square. God is playing one square. They're all together. Faith, trust, belief, obedience. They're designed to function as one thing. So let's go back to Hebrews chapter 11. Shake hands with the hero. Hebrews chapter 11 is a tremendous chapter. It might have been a better sermon if I'd have just got up and read Hebrews chapter 11 and sat down, but then you wouldn't have got the picture. So, Hebrews chapter 11 is full of amazing stories of faith. We read some of those. You've got Abraham and Moses and Joseph, and on it goes. There's so many great heroes in chapter 11. Go back and read it later today. You'll get a lot out of it. Here's some things to know about these guys. None of them were perfect. They all had flaws. In fact, several of them had flaws displayed very plainly. Sometimes we sit and read about their flaws and we get kind of smug and say, I can't believe they said that, or I can't believe they did that. What were they thinking? And they're the heroes of faith. None of them were perfect. All of them had difficult lives. I challenge you to find anybody in the Hebrews chapter 11 that we look at as biblical heroes. Find one of them that you look at the details of their life and say, wow, I wish those things would happen to me. It just isn't like that. Now, they had great lives, but they faced real challenges in their life. It's funny, sometimes we think if we're having a tough time, if things aren't going the way that I think they ought to go, there must be something wrong. What's God doing? I don't understand. They all dealt with that same stuff pretty often. They all had faith, trust, belief, whatever you want to call it. That's why they're in the chapter. They had that in a great way. And here's where the obedience part comes in. They obeyed because that was the logical and sensible thing to do, because their faith was real. I tried to think of an example that was kind of an outlandish example that I could use as an illustration. So here's what I came up with. Let's say you were a person who studied astronomy and you knew that there was going to be a meteor that was going to hit the earth. And you realized that this meteor that was going to hit the earth was going to come to your town. And you drilled down a little bit more and realized that that meteor was going to hit your town, your neighborhood, your house, where your children were at. Is there any scenario where you would genuinely believe that and not go get your kids out of that house? You say, no, of course not. That doesn't make any sense. You know that this is going to happen. You believe this is going to happen. Anybody would go and get their kids out of that house and clear the neighborhood and warn people, all those things. That makes sense because of faith. And yet, very often, we detach faith from action and talk about them as though they are separate, unrelated things that don't necessarily need to travel together. Trust and faith need to travel with actions. That's what made these guys heroes. Real faith or trust result in actions. So let's talk about something that is really important, and that's the idea of concept versus reality. We're going to compare religious people to Jesus, religion to Jesus, all right? This concept versus reality idea. Turn over in your Bibles to Luke chapter 10. No slide for this. You got to do the work and actually turn the pages, or the electrons, whichever the case may be. Luke chapter 10. We're not going to read all of this passage, but it's one that we know well, even if we only know the Bible as literature. And it's the passage of the Good Samaritan. So Jesus is asked in verse 25, says, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? Jesus answered. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus said. Do this, and you will live. Man, what a great conversation. He asked him a question. Jesus asks for his opinion. He gives it, and Jesus says, that's exactly right. You do that, and you're going to be fine. You would think that might be the end of it. But look at the next verse. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Oh. Religion tends towards theory, not putting things into practice. That's the nature of things. And so Jesus goes on and tells this parable of the Good Samaritan to illustrate his point. And it's a worthy study. It's more than we can do today. But the point of the story is he says, hey, this guy got beat up, left half dead. And these three people passed by him. One was a priest, one was a Levite, one was a Samaritan. The first two passed by him and ignored him and went on their way. In fact, they went over to the other side of the road so they didn't have to get close to him. And the other guy, who was the guy that you would expect was a bad guy because he was a Samaritan, he stopped and helped the guy and put him up and took money out of his own pocket. And Jesus puts the question to him at the end. He says, which one of those guys was his neighbor? And the religious guy sheepishly says, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus says, there's your answer. Do that, and you'll be okay. But you see, he wanted to get away from the actual practice and make it a theoretical idea. Look, that's what people in the past did. That's what people down the street do. But guess what? Sorry, this includes us. This is human nature about trusting God and putting faith into practice. We want to make it conceptual. So let me give you a couple of examples. Jesus is Lord. Don't you just get goosebumps hearing that phrase? I mean, when somebody has a baptism and we ask them, let's pretend together. Somebody's up in the baptistry and they ask them the questions. Maybe they ask them the real long version of the questions. And then they get to the end and they say, and what's your good confession? Now, I want you to pretend this is happening. And they say, Jesus is Lord. That's what we do, right? I mean, we're excited about that. And we should be. And I think that's genuine. And I think the person standing in the water means every word they're saying. So that's all good. Turn to Colossians chapter 2. Colossians chapter 2 and verse 6 and 7. So then, just as you received Christ Jesus as Lord, continue to live your lives in him, rooted and built up, strengthened in the faith as you were taught, and overflowing with thankfulness. See, this Jesus is Lord idea is not meant to be just something that is really great when you're baptized and that we get excited about in theory. It's meant to be how we live our lives day to day, all the time. Now, we're not talking about being sinless and perfect. I mean, that if you meet somebody who can pull that off, I'm impressed by them and I'd like to meet them. But that's not been my experience with myself or with others. That's not what we're talking about. So what are we talking about in this idea of ongoing lordship? Well, I'll give you an example. You fill in the blanks yourself, because I don't know what your fill-in would be. I know I should blank, but blank. I know I should blank, but blank. Here's what we're doing when we have that conversation with ourselves. I know I should, and we put in something that we know we should obey, but, and then we put in our excuse for not doing it. Is that lordship? Is that living with Jesus? No, look, I'm talking to me just as much as I am you. That's not living in the lordship of Jesus. We've got to get there through trust in God. That's how we overcome that. Let me give you a second example. One another relationships. I think that we as a church have a great belief in one another relationships. In fact, I think that we would say we think that's one of our calling cards. One of the things that sets us apart as a group is the love and the relationships we have with one another. And I think that, there's a lot of that goes on, and that's great stuff. Here's some of the things that the Bible calls us to, that the Bible commands us to do in our one another relationships. If you want to take a picture, get your phone out, because there's going to be a bunch of them. All right? Love one another. Honor one another. Accept one another. Teach one another, encourage one another, correct one another, strengthen one another, pray for one another, spur one another on, rebuke one another, admonish one another, greet one another, serve one another, forgive one another, instruct one another. That's a lot of stuff, and there's more. I didn't even have room on the slide for confess and several other ones. I mean, there's a bunch more of them. So here's the question. We believe in one another relationships. These things ought to be typical things that are going on in our life all of the time. And we ought to be pitching as well as catching, right? I mean, I need to receive those things, but if we're going to have that going on in the church, in addition to receiving those things, I've got to give those things to others. So here's the question for us. Are these things in our life in a strong way? I mean, I'm not talking about just onesie twosie. I mean, are these things going on in my life all the time? Is my belief a concept or a reality? We've got to, through trust in God, get to a point where the things that we hold dear, the things that we believe, are reality, are a real part of our life and our faith in practice. As we close out, I'm going to give you some watchwords to live by. Now, you might be wondering, that's a strange way to title for this slide. Why do you have watchwords? Well, I am a watch guy, okay? I love watches. I have a few of them, and I look at them more than I even have them. There's something about the intricacy of the mechanism and the precision and all that kind of stuff that I just really like them, okay? And so I'm looking at this watch online, and of all the places to find inspiration, this watchmaker puts these 3 phrases on the back of their watch. Start where you are. Okay. Use what you have and do what you can. I looked at that and I said, man, I like that. That's beautiful. That's inspiring. That makes me want to be a better man. Trouble is, the watch costs $3,500. So I didn't want that much inspiration. So that didn't work out so well. But good news, I found out that they stole that quote from Arthur Ashe. And so I could get it for free with this poster. I don't know if they paid him royalties for that. And what's more, if you want to do it backwards, you can go with Teddy Roosevelt. It's kind of the same idea, it's just in the opposite order. So here's what I want us to close with. Let's talk about us, because we got to get some faith in those inspirational quotes. I like the first part just fine the way it is. Start where you are. Here's the thing about trusting God and having faith. Sometimes we put it off because we don't think we're at the starting line yet. I don't care what the deal is, you've always got to start where you're at. You know, maybe you're in college and you say, okay, well, once I get out of school, I'm really going to get started on this faith stuff. And then you get a job and you say, well, I'm just getting started in my career. Things are really busy right now. I'm working extra hours. But once things settle down a little bit, I'm going to do this God thing. And then, you get married and you have kids. Yeah, right now it's busy because the kids are, oh boy, these kids. I see Julian back there nodding his, oh yeah, those kids. Those kids are a lot to keep after, but as soon as I get clear of that a little bit, and once they're out of diapers, I don't know what we think that's going to change. You know how if somebody says, once my kids are out of diapers, it'll be better. You know what you know about them? Their kids are still in diapers. Because they're going to figure out once they're out of diapers, they're not any easier. But once they get out of diapers, I'll do this God thing. And we just keep kicking the can down the road a little farther and a little. We've got to start where we are. Trust today. Number 2, offer what you have. Offer what you have to God. Sometimes I think that we hold back because we feel inadequate. We don't have enough. We're not capable of doing what God has called us to, so we do nothing. Wednesday night, it was one of my favorite things in the Bible is the feeding of the 5,000. The amazing part to me about the feeding of the 5,000 isn't the miracle itself, or the fact that they picked up 12 basketfuls after it was over. The most impressive part of the whole story to me in the feeding of the 5,000 is the kid with two fish and 5 loaves gave it to Jesus when Jesus was looking for food. He didn't have the food to feed the 5,000. He just had a couple of fish and 5 loaves. But he took it to God and said, this isn't enough, but it's what I've got. Take it. We need to live that way. Don't wait until you think you've got the problem solved or all worked out, or I think I have enough to get it done. I need to give God what I have to offer. And let God take it from there. Number 3, choose faith daily. Sometimes faith can be a once a week thing, or a once in a while thing, or a morning thing. We've got to choose faith every day. Make that decision to have faith on a daily basis. Number 4, live in Him. This goes back to that Colossians 2 reference. Live life as a disciple. Don't just acknowledge Jesus as Lord, live with Him as Lord. We need to live with Him and walk with Him and be aware of His presence and trust Him as a traveling companion, not just as some celestial supervisor. It needs to be an ongoing relationship. Number 5, do what you can. Sometimes we're so focused on what we think we can't do that we miss out on what we can do. If we all do what we can, God will take care of the rest. Trusting God means doing what you can. Grow as you're enabled by God. You know, what you are today is not what you'll end up being. What you can do today and what you can do 10 years from now, if you trust God on a daily basis and choose faith on a daily basis, are wildly different. Grow as God enables you. And lastly, realize God's intention. God has, as we talked about earlier this week, God has a plan for our lives. God had a plan for the lives of the guys in Hebrews chapter 11. You know, but where they started, it didn't seem like those plans were terribly reasonable. I mean, you know, Abraham didn't know anything about the land that God was going to give him. And he was barren. You know, his wife was barren. How's God going to work all that out? We'll talk about that next week. Moses was an 80-year-old shepherd who was on the run from Egypt, and he sure didn't look like the guy who was going to deliver the nation of Israel. I mean, Joseph was sold as a slave and put in prison. His whole story is nothing in his story up to the point where things started to change said he's going to be the ruler of Egypt and he's going to lead to the Jewish nation exploding. None of that seemed possible, but that was God's intention. Because they had faith, we revere them as heroes. If we trust God and have faith and choose to live in Him daily, someday someone will feel that way about us. And the point of this isn't, well, I want to be great someday. The point of this is you're more than you think you are. I'm more than I think I am. What makes the magic happen is trusting God and making a decision to live in faith every day. So as we go into this year, let's really make it a point to trust God and give our lives to Him and see where He takes us. Amen.